Order, order. Welcome to today's Foreign Affairs Committee meeting. We have 4 witnesses before us today to talk about our counter-terrorism inquiry. Can I ask you, please, to introduce yourself, perhaps Edmund first?
Thank you. I'm Edmund Fitton-Brown. I'm a former British diplomat, former United Nations counter-terrorism coordinator, and currently working with the Counter-Extremism Project. I think the threat endures because the groups that threaten us endure, and I think that's because of enduring conflict in the region. The conflict has not been addressed, and poor governance in the region has not been addressed. And maybe the question could just as easily be, why is the threat less than you might expect? And I think that it's less than you might expect because of the effectiveness of counter-terrorism measures, which have dramatically improved over the past 20 years. But the latent threat is there, and if we relax on counter-terrorism, we are likely to suffer for it.
Can I ask, if you're both saying that governance is potentially part of the problem, what should the UK have been doing, and the US? You mentioned the US as well. What should they have been doing, and what should they be doing now to try and address those root causes, governance perhaps particularly?
I mean, I think that's right. Of course, investment in that area can also look like interference. And so from having direct experience of working in British embassies in the Middle East and having many friends and former colleagues who are still doing it, there is a lot of good work going on, but there's only so much that you can do as outsiders. And of course, it's slowed by the enduring conflict. The conflict is difficult. If you look at the complexities within Iraq, you can see why it's extremely hard to reform the governance of the country.
Hasn't what's given it terrorism a huge boost has been America's, the United Kingdom's invasion of Iraq, the bombing of Libya, and while it's not the Middle East or North Africa, it represents something, the invasion and occupation for 20 years of Afghanistan. Isn't that a bigger driver than anything you've mentioned? And wouldn't it be better, one, if we hadn't done those things, and two, if we got out, because we seem to be making it worse?
But I don't think it does any favours to the UK or the US, or indeed to the region itself, to suggest that this is all done by outsiders. There was extensive Islamist terrorism throughout the 1990s, and there was no invasion to respond to then.
No, I was making a case, I was asking the question, whether the case could be made that those invasions and interferences had made it worse and had given more fertile ground to radical Islam.
I think in Iraq, clearly, yes.
Thank you, Chair. Can I maybe go a bit deeper into Iraq and Syria and where we are currently? 2019, we boldly announced that Daesh had been defeated. It appears certainly not to be the case. And how and why and to what extent have Daesh or ISIS been able to reorganise in Iraq and Syria? Where are we now?
Can I just add, I think the prognosis in Syria is grim. And it's not great in Iraq either, but it is very serious in Syria. And the problem is that essentially the old sort of Pax Assad that used to exist has broken down, but Assad is still there. And so what you have is this small minority of Alawites with their foreign backers, Iranians, Hezbollah, Russia, sort of holding on. But the majority of the population in Syria is Sunni Arab, and they feel that they never envisage that they will make peace with Assad. And this is the problem. It means that people like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or al-Qaeda in Syria, the Harasadin, or ISIS, they're going to hold on in Syria because they anticipate that their time will come again.
Yeah, on this specific point, is there also an issue about missing a potential intelligence asset? And could you possibly, three of you at least have mentioned the foreign fighters specifically. Can you give us an idea of numbers, in particular Brits, but in general, the international foreign fighter aspect?
In terms of repatriation?
In terms of how many there are, because we know roughly how many Brits went to...
We speak of low thousands.
Below 1,000?
Yeah, 1,000 to 2,000.
All foreign fighters?
Yes.
Remain?
Except it's probably worth going back to the origin of the numbers that went at the time that the caliphate first really sprang up. So then you're talking about numbers something above 40,000 foreign fighters. And if you think about a sort of rate of attrition, the number of those that have died, people can't give exact figures, but they tend to say probably less than half have died. So that means that you've got more than 20,000 people who need to be accounted for in one way or another. Now, some of them are still in the region. Some of them have relocated elsewhere. Many have returned to their homes. Some of them have gone through judicial systems, prosecutions, or in some cases it's not been possible to prosecute, but they've simply returned home. And then you have this, obviously the issue arises then of what will be the recidivism rate. So this is a very, very serious issue. There's never been a foreign fighter issue on this scale before, and I think that comes back to Mr. O'Hara's point again. Are we dealing with it? People are dealing with it. There's a lot of effort being made. The United Nations is making a lot of effort. Some countries have pushed hard on repatriations, particularly Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. The Central Asian republics have been very good, and a number of other countries have been pretty good on repatriations. But it's still not good enough. The numbers in al-Hol camp have been driven down, but they're still far too high. And that point about the threat, is the threat current or long term? So currently the threat is suppressed by very effective CT action and by the fact that Islamic State has lost its capability to direct terrorist attacks. But long term, the threat is going to be very high indeed.
And if I could follow on from that, so obviously last week we saw the US, UK and other forces strike against Houthi targets as a result of the drone attacks against shipping in the Red Sea. Do you see al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula further working with the Houthis to ratchet up and increase attacks either on shipping or potentially other attacks against Western interests? Edmund,
I don't see the relationship between the Houthis and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula as being operationally collaborative in that way. I wouldn't expect that to happen. But I think Lena's absolutely right when she says that the shift from the Houthis fighting al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to an element of cooperation and deconfliction has definitely helped both sides. And there's an interesting point about this, which is that one of the key members of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is the son of Saif al-Adil. Saif al-Adil is, of course, the new leader of al-Qaeda since the killing of Zawahiri. And Saif al-Adil is in Iran. And there are a number of interesting dimensions to that. One is, does Saif al-Adil intend at some point to relocate to Yemen? He might, because al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, as you say, has been very successful and resilient. And so if he was looking for a safe haven, that would be a possibility, and the Yemeni conflict provides that sort of safe haven. But of course, it's very much in Iran's interests that the Houthis are their proxy, and now they're hosting al-Qaeda's leader, and al-Qaeda's leader's son is in AQAP. So Iran may have had a role in this.
We do, sorry. So is there something in then what Vice President al-Zubaydi says about the Southern Transitional Council being, I don't know, armed, supported, whatever, in order to push back on the Houthis? If we're saying they're a terrorist organisation and we are now striking them and al-Qaeda is no friend of ours, is there something in that suggestion? I mean, I have no view on it. I've only read it yesterday. I don't know what.
So I would agree with that. I think trying to second guess Saudi Arabia and its allies over Yemen internal politics would be a mistake. I can't see us wanting to get involved in that in any way. I do agree that there is an elephant in the room, which is Iran, and clearly developing coherent British, American, Western policies towards Iran, that will be important. But I think where I would differ with Lena is that I see what is happening in the Red Sea as a distinct challenge which has to be met and has to be met now. And I think that the government and the US government have played this precisely correctly. This is not anything to do with the Middle East. This is not anything to do with Gaza. This is a threat to international shipping and international trade. It has to be faced down. And I don't think these are tit-for-tat attacks. I think this is a surgical attempt to degrade the Houthi capability to mount these attacks. The Houthis will continue to mount them. They will be defiant. But whether they will be effective, whether they will be able to maintain them at the level that they were, I think that's not so clear. I think in that respect we have a chance of success.
And then just finally, Edmund, if I may, the UK is, of course, the pen holder at the UN when it comes to Yemen. What more can be done in that forum to try and contain and address the situation?
Well, I mean, it was good that there was a resolution passed. So, you know, the very fact that Russia and China didn't veto, that was good work in New York. It's very, very, so I mean, of course the UN is heavily invested in a peace process in Yemen, and we all want to see a peace process in Yemen. It was interesting that the announcement of progress between the Saudis and the Houthis came when this maritime campaign was already well underway, and when it was becoming clear that there would be a counteraction from the US and the UK and others. And so how real that progress is, how likely that is to lead to a peace agreement. It's hard to imagine the Houthis simultaneously holding constructive talks in Yemen about peace and making accommodations with the various other factions in Yemen, whilst conducting this policy in the Red Sea, which, quite apart from its impact on international shipping, can have an impact on Houthis and its ability to take in trade and aid that Yemen desperately needs. So I think this Houthi policy is fundamentally contradictory. I think it can be faced down, and I think it will fade away. And yes, of course, we must continue to support the UN in pushing this peace process, because the fundamental problem is that when you have ungoverned space and when you have conflict, you then have terrorism as a result. But I don't think that is a reason not to face the Houthis down in the Red Sea.
Thank you. Can I focus on the UK relations with the Gulf states, and perhaps ask you, Mr. Fitton-Brown, to start with, how well does the UK use multilateral, bilateral trade and security agreements to use its influence to counter terrorism in the Gulf region?
I think generally it does it well. The relations with all of the Gulf countries are good. They're very strong with Saudi Arabia, very strong with Oman. Actually, I mean, I won't even single them out because they're all strong. And of course, there's some work with the GCC, so you do it in a collective way. And the UK also is plugged into efforts that the Americans and others are making. The intelligence relationship with Oman, of course, is a very important one. The Saudis have been crucial counter-terrorist partners for us in the era since 9/11. So I think it is pretty good. I think where I worry a little bit still is that there's still a lot of private donor money that goes from Arabian Peninsula countries to terrorist groups. That's always been the case, and it was true that money was going to al-Qaeda, going to ISIS, going to the Taliban from the peninsula. Now, whether those governments are strong enough in facing that down, or whether they are too quick to accommodate the sort of proclivities of their individual citizens and wealthy donors with strong Islamist sympathies, I think there is a problem there, and I think there is one of the things that the 7th of October has highlighted is that there is a problem of the Qatari tolerance of Hamas.
Where is the balance at the moment between us engaging on trade and security versus Britain espousing its sort of democratic human rights values, and is the balance right at the moment? Mr. Fitton-Brown in on this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lena makes some very good points there. I always wish we would emphasise more rule of law than sort of, if you like, Western liberal values. I mean, of course, we have our Western liberal values and we're proud of them, but we can't impose them on other people. And one of the key questions you have to ask is: are these countries do they have rule of law? And to a large degree, that yes, they do. Even though that law can seem, harsh to us, and that links, of course, to enforcement in the Red Sea. It's about the law of the sea, and indeed most of what we're dealing with in the world at the moment is between lawless countries and the countries that are wedded to the rules-based international system. So I think that there is a sort of a thread there to hold on to about rule of law.
Do you think our relationship is as strong as it could be? How do we
with which one?
With the Gulf states?
The Gulf states generally.
Generally, yes. And what hinders our relationship, maybe in comparison to other countries?
We have extremely strong relations in each country. We tend to send good ambassadors there, with and the history tends to help us. It's not unhelpful, although sometimes current affairs can bring turbulence. I think sometimes, I think maybe that point about rule of law, I do wonder whether we sometimes seem to be very hostile to Sharia law in countries that actually choose to use Sharia law. It seems to me that it's strange that we lecture people about the death penalty when whatever we ourselves think of the death penalty in the UK or elsewhere. The fact is that the Americans have it, the Russians have it, the Chinese have it, and it's prescribed under Sharia. And yet we allow ourselves, for example, to butt heads with the Iraqi authorities, who have enough to deal with without having to be lectured by the West about why do they have the death penalty. So I think that's one area where we could be more careful. But coming back to Lena's point, I do think it's interesting seeing the progress that has happened in Saudi Arabia. And I think what is interesting there, and when you look at the Arabian Peninsula, of course, they're all significant countries, but Saudi Arabia is by far the largest, and it is the leader, and of course it's also the leader of the Islamic world because of the location of the holy places in Mecca and Medina. And if Saudi Arabia continues to progress towards reform, then that's a major gain in terms of the stabilization of the region.
I move to you, Mr. Fitton-Brown, and ask you this. The UN reports that Daesh Libya has focused its recruitment on scientists that may be able to produce so-called biological materials. Now, how seriously should we take those reports in the UK?
Well, I mean, I think with non-conventional weapons, this is always a worry, and there is an established intent for Daesh to use, to develop that kind of weaponry. They tried to do it using the academic facilities that they controlled in Iraq during the era of the so-called caliphate. I think, in spite of that, their capability in Libya is not that great. It's not a large presence. It's not a presence that controls significant territory or significant facilities. So I think it would be one to watch, but I wouldn't say it was the biggest concern that we should have.
So moving back to you, Mr. Fitton-Brown, because you're former ambassador to Egypt, as I recall.
Not ambassador, but I was diplomat there.
Sorry,
yes.
Diplomat. My apologies. I can't remember if you were there when I last went there. But what strengths and weaknesses, and maybe somebody else would like to come in on this as well, would you draw from Egypt's suppression of terrorism, and in particular their efforts in targeting Daesh Sinai?
Well, they seem to have been fairly successful with Daesh Sinai, but you can ask the question of why Daesh Sinai became a concern in the first place. It shouldn't really have been much of a concern. It's not as if the Sinai particularly leads anywhere. It's something of a cul-de-sac. Yeah. And what that reflects is that the relationship between the government in Cairo and the people of Sinai was not good. And that meant that there was a lot of sort of natural hostility to Egyptian authority and sympathy for Daesh. And there was an interesting point also there that there appeared to be some Daesh control of some tunnels into Gaza. And obviously Gaza is under Hamas control. Hamas is not sympathetic to Daesh, but there is some presence of Daesh within Gaza. So that was concerning, that you had a potential link there across into Palestine. The Egyptians have had a long-running domestic extremism problem, the longest of all, of course. Going back to the history that we spoke about earlier. They have a way of dealing with it, which is that they know best, and they don't really want to contract it out to partners or allies. And that's caused a lot of problems in their dealings with the UK in the past, where they simply will not tell you if there's a problem in Egypt, and then something happens, and you have an attack, and then understandably perhaps other countries or companies react to that, and they don't feel safe anymore, and so they then sort of react in a way that the Egyptians consider to be unhelpful to Egypt's prosperity. So it's a tricky relationship, and of course, I think the Americans have been working that hard as well. They have a very strong relationship with the Egyptians, but it's not an easy one. They've had to work hard with them over managing the Gaza issue, and of course the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, highly relevant to the Egyptian economy because of the Suez Canal. So Egypt it's a critical partner and ally in the region, but not an easy one.
Anybody else who wants to come in on this? What do you think is the overlap between terrorism and organised crime in the region in North Africa, and does it have an impact on the UK and its security interests regionally and here at home?
Yeah, I think I would echo that. I think there is a worry about siloing between people dealing with organised crime and dealing with terrorism, and I think it does need to be better integrated. And also that there shouldn't be a sort of sense that terrorism is the bigger deal than organised crime. I'm not sure that it is. I think you can make a case for the reverse. And it was very striking in the UN when they passed the resolution 2482, I think it was, that talked about the overlap between organised crime and terrorism. That it felt as if that was a sort of a grab for resources. If we say that organised crime is linked with terrorism, we'll get more resources onto it. And I think that reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the priority between the two and the fluidity between the two.
And I suppose my question, if you recognise it's rather more than an elephant, that has the policy of the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, over via Obama, different European regimes, have we been too soft on Iran? Because the basis of that policy has been to say, well, you can have a bit more uranium and oil revenues if you behave a bit better. Putting it simply, and they haven't behaved better. They've, if anything, behaved a good deal worse. Do you think we should change our policy?
No, I mean, I think it's a very fair point that you make. It is, we've talked a lot about this so-called axis of resistance. The Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, these Iraqi Shia militias, and Iran, of course, is the sort of the coordinator of all of that. And Iran, for many, many years, has pursued these extremely aggressive, sort of asymmetric policies. It's just more comfortable with conflict than we are. It's more comfortable with conflict than Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states are. And so it's gained a lot of advantage. And there's been a perception in the region that Iran has advanced on a number of fronts and grown stronger. And I think that maybe the main fault in the way that we responded was that we separated out the nuclear issue from the axis of resistance issue, and we prioritised the nuclear issue. We had the JCPOA. Personally, I think the JCPOA was a good agreement. If you're looking to try to tie the Iranians down to a system where you would have really long early warning before they attempted breakout, I think JCPOA was pretty good, and I think the worst of all possible worlds was to have the JCPOA and then for the Americans to withdraw from it. So I don't want to be too critical of the JCPOA. I think it was not a bad deal. I think people can legitimately criticise it and say that it should have been even stronger, but it was a worthy effort to create something that would give us assurance. The problem was that in so doing it, we parked the issue of all of this asymmetric aggression from the Iranians, and they are behaving this year and last year as if they feel they have a license to do this indefinitely. And it is leading us towards a point where we're going to have to find a way of sending a message to them that this cannot continue.
Just if I can follow that up with a very quick question, very quick answer, hopefully. The Economist had an editorial, I think in the middle of December, saying Iran was weaker than it had been for some time. Would you agree with the Economist's assessment?
And I think you can make that case. And of course, one of the things that people always used to say when they were negotiating JCPOA and sort of saying, let's not be too bellicose, was that they were saying, and as this is happening, we see civil society flourishing in Iran, we see these protest movements, we see the authorities increasingly struggling to contain them. And sometimes you talk to people who want to do business in Iran, like oil companies, and they say, well, we know where we're going to be in 20 years' time. It will have changed. It's just a question of how you get to that change. So I understand what The Economist means. The Iranians are only strong if you regard them as strong in terms of being able to make trouble. They're not strong in terms of being able to secure the interests of their people.
Thank you.
The House of Lords International Relations Committee did a report in 2017 which suggested that the UK should focus on its own international national interests rather than mirroring those of the US. And this joint strike on the Houthis sort of underlines that position that we can be seen, if not we are, tending to just mirror what the US does. They suggest that perhaps we should not do that quite so much. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think we're strongest when we work in concert with the Americans. That's partly to do with the special relationship. It's partly to do with the depth and organic nature of the intelligence relationship with the Americans. But I think if you are reinsuring for all future political outcomes in Washington, D.C., then there does need to be some attention paid by the UK and by European like-minded countries to what is our independent capability if we have to act independently of the US.